Can you tell us about this event in Michigan and why you're bringing it here and what you hope to accomplish?
We're having an event on March 5th. It's called Jobs and Human Needs, and we are trying to raise awareness both in Michigan and elsewhere in the country about the different investments that need to be made by the federal government in jobs and human needs. We're trying to raise the idea that a lot of the investment's going into the military where it doesn't need to be, and it actually needs to be here at home in Michigan.
One of the things I hear about all the time from Washington, both from the President and Congress, is we are going to look at the budget except for defense spending. Why do they do that all the time, and why is defense always off the table?
I'm not sure why defense is always off the table. It's one of the many agencies that we have, and if I were doing the budget for the federal government the way we do a budget for ourselves at home around our kitchen tables, we look at what it is we really need. What is it that we actually need to do? And especially if we're in tough times, like right now, the nation is facing large debts and large deficit spending and so on, and it needs to get its house in order. So what you look at is, what do you actually need to continue to fund? And for some reason, the Congress and the President have constantly taken defense spending off the table as if it is just, of course, needed. And yet I think both know, I think both parties in Congress and the President know that there's a lot in that budget that really can be cut. It has grown, it's doubled in the last 10 years, it's absolutely doubled. And our budget is like, our defense budget is equal to all of the military spending of the rest of the world. Our friends, our enemies, whoever they are, add them all together, and that about equals our military budget. Why do we have to have such a huge budget compared to the world? It's just amazing to us. We've got bases over in Europe guarding something, I'm not sure. We have this tendency to have things left over from past wars. So we're still building weapons that would have been great to have in World War II, but we build them now. Why? You know, there's a lot to be looked at there to save quite a bit of money. And that money could be used to bring the deficit down so that we're not spending money we don't have. It could be used to invest in creating jobs, because that's what we really need right now to get back on our feet. There was a study done this last summer by a bipartisan group called together by Representative Barney Frank and Representative Walter Jones and Ron Paul. So across the spectrum there, of rather liberal to rather conservative. And they asked defense experts to come up with what actually could be cut in the military budget. So they came up with a plan that has a lot of specifics in it that amounts to cutting about $100 billion a year over the next 10 years. So they get to almost $1 trillion that they would cut out of the military budget. And they would do things like looking at the bases and bringing people not just home to be on military bases here, but actually not have so many troops. Because if we're just guarding Germany, maybe we need to ask whether we need to do that quite so much. Maybe we don't need such a big military. Maybe we don't need some of these weapon systems that in fact the Pentagon says they don't need. Or they're designed for the kind of warcraft that just isn't done anymore. Maybe they can look at how some of the benefit structures go for the military, not in the sense that you're going to hurt the troops, but after people are out of the military, there's a military, they call it TRICARE system, where the yearly payment of $438 for a family is actually less than my employer pays for me per month. So there are some adjustments that could be made there very reasonably on all of the areas of the budget that, that could bring the spending down a lot. One of the biggest things to look at is contractors, because a lot of what the military does right now is handled by contractors. And there was a study done by the Washington Post over the summer also about who are all these contractors. And it's not just people that build weapon systems, it's like people that read the Arabic newspapers and translate them for the Pentagon. They actually have 5 different companies doing that. I don't know why they need 5. But they found that the Pentagon is not even aware of how many contracts it has. It has no function of making sure that they're delivering what they're supposed to deliver. They don't know about redundancy among them. And there are just thousands of these contracts all over the place. many of which are probably not needed. So that's one area that they can cut back just by getting their fiscal house in order. They could be subject to an audit, like all of the other agencies are. The Pentagon has never been audited, so no wonder they don't know where all these billions go. They have a record of overspending. Congress will authorize a certain amount of money for building of a weapons system, and then over a period of 5 years, they did sort of an audit. They did a study on it, and found that they had $300 billion spent over what had been authorized. $300 billion. That's bigger than the budgets of some of the cabinet departments. And so now when they're saying we can't afford this and that, I would say we can't afford that kind of cost overruns, and we can't afford that kind of waste, and we can't afford weapons that we don't need or use. We can't afford to be the world's police. There are a lot of things there that if we sat down and said, what do we really need, that we would not say those were among those things we needed.
When you talk about the Pentagon budget, where does the occupation of Iraq and Afghanistan fit in there? Because sometimes I get the impression that even those numbers aren't really counted when you're looking at the overall spending on military for the U.S.
Well, it depends on what number you're looking at, of course, and you always need to ask, does that include war fighting? The practice just recently has been that you give the Pentagon a core budget just to be the Pentagon, and then if you want to do something with that money, like fight a war, you give them more money in a supplemental. So you have to add that in when you're looking at the total that the Pentagon is spending. We joke, I guess it's not really a joke, that wouldn't it be nice if an agency like Department of Education or Health and Human Services could just have a core budget just to be a bureaucracy, and then if they actually wanted to teach anyone or provide any services, that they would get a supplemental for that. But that's actually what happens with the Pentagon. It's very strange.
There's frightening news to me coming out of Washington, and I'm thinking thinking about families and children, because the headlines recently was about assistance for heating.
Heating, yes.
And that's the talk where we can't afford things like that. Yet we can afford all this military spending. How are you looking at that from the perspective of the family and what we could use that money for?
Yeah. The House leadership just came out yesterday with their list of the places that they're planning to cut in this year's budget. We're in the 2011 budget. It has a few more months to run until October. And on that list are a large number of programs that affect families, especially low-income families. So home heating is one of them, and there's the community action agencies that coordinate both that program and the Head Start program. There's a program called WIC, Women, Infants, and Children, is a nutritional supplement where you have to be shown not only to be poor, but also that you and your child are nutritionally deficient. If you're a nursing mother, you would also get supplemental food. So that program has had bipartisan support for years. It can show that the children that are on that program and get adequate nutrition when they're little save the government a lot of money later in not needing Medicaid services and in being able to perform well in school and so on. It pays itself back over and over again. That program is getting a 10% cut in the budget that they're working on right now. And yet the Pentagon, they did finally take a little tiny sliver off of it in this most recent list. They're taking $300 million out of the Pentagon. The Pentagon budget is almost $1 trillion. So they're taking a little tiny slice out of that, but it's nothing compared to the 10% that they're taking away from this very vital program. If we wanted to address the debt and deficit problems, it's like a three-legged stool that we need to do. And one is to cut selected spending. And the second leg of that stool is actually spending, but it's military spending that, because it's so big, it gets its own leg on the stool. And the third is revenues. We need more revenues than we're getting right now. The U.S. Amount of revenue that it takes in overall compared to the gross domestic product, how big our economy is, it's really low. There's only 2 countries in the developed world that charge less. I think it's Mexico and Turkey. I'm not quite sure about that, but there's only 2 that bring in less taxes for their size of their economy. And we have a lot of room to grow on that. We have very low tax rates actual tax rates for corporations and very low actual tax rates for wealthy people. There's the statutory rate, what it says in the law books, and then there's what they actually pay by the time their accountants get done. So it's very, very low. A lot of loopholes in between those two numbers. And then just recently there was a tax cut that had been allowed from the last time we were in recession, and it was supposed to go away by 10 years later, so that we wouldn't always have this tax cut. And one part of that tax cut was for very wealthy people. And the proposal this past year was to let that one go ahead and expire, because the very wealthy people were not suffering from the recession. They actually, many of them did quite well during the recession, while the rest of us lost our jobs and our homes and so on. So we let them not have that tax cut anymore and leave the tax cuts in place for the lower income people. That didn't go through. And at the end of the year, the very end of the year, President Obama made a deal with the Congress to let all of the tax cuts continue. So that means that people with very high incomes are still getting a lot of benefit. At the highest end, the 1% top end, they're getting something like an average of a $77,000 tax cut from that per year, more than most of us ever make in a year. And that is outrageous. So we think that there need to be more actual taxes at that higher end, and we need that income to come back into the system so that we can afford what we really need here at home. We can afford to create some jobs, and we can afford to keep that safety net whole so that people don't just fall into nothing when the economy fails them.
Why isn't there more of a reaction from the American public on these types of issues? Because there's such a big impact on the American family and people and college students and people's health and welfare. Why isn't there more of an outcry on this?
Well, I have that question myself, why there isn't more of an outcry, but I really think that it has to do with what they know, what people know. People are not hearing these things directly. They're moving very fast in Congress right now. And what they're hearing is, Washington is wasting all this money, Washington has to do this and that. That's what's on the headlines around the country, and not a sense of that there are choices to be made. There are very real choices to be made, and it is not true that Congress must cut the food from your table. It is not true that Congress can't help anymore if you've lost your home. And it is not true that these things are unaffordable. They are only unaffordable if they want to continue to waste money on the military and to waste money by allowing these huge tax loopholes to very wealthy people.
Michigan is in a unique position because we're in such economic straits here.
Yeah.
What do you suggest to the Michigan people? What can Michigan people do in this situation?
Michigan needs jobs, very, very clearly. That you asked early on, why are we doing this here? And that's partly why. Because Michigan knows probably better than most of the nation how important it is to have jobs. We want to use this conference as a way to showcase to members of Congress, especially to the Michigan members of Congress, but also others, that there are some things that need to be done about jobs directly. And we know that they're going to cost some investments. Actually, the government itself may need to create jobs directly in order to give people enough money to spend, to buy things like cars, and to then create the private sector jobs that are going to produce those cars. It's pretty clear that private employers, no matter how many tax breaks you give them or incentives or whatever, they're not going to hire more people until there are customers to buy their goods. So we need to have more investment in the economy, perhaps in the terms of directly creating jobs, so that people get back on their feet, are able to purchase goods, and then the private owners of businesses can sell those goods and can manufacture those goods. So that's what Michigan needs to get back on its feet, is some very direct and very significant help with the creation of jobs.